Hello, everyone. Tonight, we dive into a chilling story that has haunted a small corner of the United States for nearly 2 decades. A couple's disappearance, seemingly without a trace. And the dark mystery that has unfolded around it will leave you questioning everything you think you know about trust, fate, and the sinister secrets hidden within the shadows of society. Before we dive into the story, let me remind you this channel is not for everyone. Only for those brave enough to uncover dark secrets and face the truth no matter how unsettling it may be. If you're ready to hear truths that will make you question everything you think you know about safety, love, and betrayal, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Let us know where you're watching from, because this story could happen anywhere in the United States. Now, let's begin. It was supposed to be the perfect vacation. A break from the chaos of everyday life. Kate and Jack had been together for 3 years, and they were excited to escape their busy lives for a romantic cruise. They were from Austin, Texas, a city known for its live music, bustling streets, and vibrant culture. But this trip was meant to offer them something different, a peaceful getaway, far from the demands of work, friends, and family. They had booked the cruise months in advance, planning to leave behind the noise of city life for a while. The cruise ship was set to depart from Galveston, a port city along the Gulf Coast, where the salty air and wide ocean horizons promised serenity. The idea of exploring new places, meeting new people, and relaxing in the sun felt like a dream come true. The ship itself was a massive vessel, gleaming white against the backdrop of a calm blue sea. On the evening of their departure, Kate and Jack stood at the ship's railing, watching the city of Galveston fade into the distance, swallowed by the horizon. The warm, salty breeze tangled Kate's hair as she rested her head on Jack's shoulder. Content and carefree, that evening, they dined in one of the ship's fancy restaurants, enjoying seafood and tropical cocktails. There was laughter, music, and the gentle sway of the boat beneath their feet. The couple talked about their future, about traveling the world, and starting a family. Everything seemed perfect, untouched by the dark unknown that was waiting just ahead. But by the next morning, something had changed. Kate and Jack were gone. It was the morning after their dinner when the crew first noticed that the couple was missing. Their cabin, located on deck 7 near the middle of the ship, was found empty. The door slightly ajar. The bed was still made. Their bags packed neatly on the floor. A quick search revealed that nothing appeared to be out of place, except for one strange detail, a single, cryptic note left on their bed. The handwriting was shaky and difficult to read, but it was clear that it was written by Kate. It simply said, "They're watching." At first, the crew assumed it was a misunderstanding, a lover's quarrel that had led to some sort of drama, perhaps with one of them running off on their own for a while. But as hours passed, and the search intensified, it became evident that something far more sinister had occurred. The ship's security reviewed surveillance footage, but there was nothing. No sign of either Kate or Jack. No departure from the ship. No one leaving through the main gates or boarding a tender boat. It was as though they had vanished without a trace. As the ship docked in the next port, Galveston became the scene of a frantic search. Police were called immediately. The couple's families were contacted, and within hours, the entire city of Austin was stunned by the news. The media swarmed the airport and the police department, covering the story with intense scrutiny. The situation seemed more serious than anyone could have imagined. But there was no clue as to where Kate and Jack could have gone. No one had seen them leave. And no one had heard anything unusual during the night. Days turned into weeks. Investigators combed through the ship, interviewed passengers, and searched the surrounding areas. Yet, despite their efforts, nothing turned up. The couple's phones went unanswered, and their social media accounts showed no signs of activity. Their families were left with nothing but questions. Jack's family, who had been devastated by the sudden news, couldn't believe it. They'd known their son to be cautious, responsible, and practical. There was no way he would just disappear without a trace. Kate's parents, too, struggled to come to terms with their daughter's disappearance. They remembered the last phone call they had received from her before she left. Kate had sounded worried, her voice shaking slightly as she mentioned feeling like someone was watching her. They had brushed it off as nothing more than nervous energy about the cruise, but now it seemed like a haunting premonition. The search for Kate and Jack dragged on for months, but the trail went cold. The authorities had no new information. The cruise line was sued for negligence, but no one was held accountable. The case grew cold, and the search was slowly abandoned. The only evidence of Kate and Jack's existence were a few photographs of the couple from the beginning of the trip, their smiling faces captured on the ship's decks, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. But the disappearance of Kate and Jack was not as simple as it seemed. In the years that followed, both families tried to move on. Jack's parents held a small memorial for him, while Kate's family continued to ask questions, hoping for a breakthrough. But time passed, and the world forgot about the couple, until 2020 when an anonymous woman came forward with a tip. The police didn't know if they should believe her. After all, what was one more vague lead in a case that had long since been closed? But the woman's story was compelling, unsettling, and the authorities couldn't ignore it. She claimed to have seen Kate or someone who looked exactly like her in a small, isolated town, living in a rundown house on the outskirts of the city. The woman, who had been a neighbor for years, didn't know the details, but she had seen a woman who was clearly in distress. It was enough to reignite the case. The authorities were skeptical, but the strange tip didn't fade away. The woman gave them a name, Elena Hall. She said that Elena, who she'd known for years, was a part of something dark, something connected to the world of human trafficking. It was a lead that gave the authorities little to go on, but still had enough weight to warrant further investigation. As the search continued, the disturbing idea began to take shape in the investigator's mind. What if Kate hadn't just vanished? What if she had been taken? What if she was out there, still alive, somewhere in the world? For now, though, there were no answers. The case of Kate and Jack's disappearance had only grown colder in the years since the cruise, and any hope of a resolution seemed far off. Still, the investigation into Kate's possible whereabouts marked the beginning of a dark journey into a world of crime, corruption, and unspeakable secrets. What had happened to the young couple all those years ago? And why did it seem that they weren't the only victims in this twisted tale? The tip came from an unlikely source, a woman named Elena Hall, whose life in the quiet, isolated town on the outskirts of Galveston was anything but ordinary. She was the kind of person who lived on the fringes, keeping to herself, a figure who didn't belong to the local community but had managed to stay under the radar. For years, She had quietly observed things she shouldn't have, things that most people either ignored or didn't dare to confront. It wasn't until 2020, when she saw a woman who looked shockingly like Kate, that she finally spoke up. The sighting was unintentional. Elena had been walking her dog on a quiet, dirt path near the edge of town, where a cluster of rundown houses stood, their peeling paint and boarded-up windows only adding to the eerie desolation of the area. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood that attracted visitors, and it wasn't the kind of place that anyone with a choice would want to live. But Elena had lived here for years, far from the busy streets of Galveston's city center, and she knew the area well. That day, as she walked past an old house, her dog's ears perked up. The dog stopped, sniffing the air, pulling Elena toward the decaying porch. She wasn't expecting much. It was a familiar routine. The dog's curiosity would lead them on little detours, but she would quickly pull him away. However, something stopped her that day. She froze in place, staring at the house's shadowed porch. In the dim light of a late afternoon, Elena caught a glimpse of a woman standing there, staring directly at her. The woman had long, dark hair, wearing a faded, once white dress. Her posture was stiff, her face pale, and her eyes were wide with fear, eyes that seemed to know they were being watched. There was something haunting about her gaze, something desperate. Elena's heart skipped a beat as she squinted to get a better look. The woman looked familiar. She couldn't place it at first, but then the recognition hit her: the face, the eyes, the haunting expression. It was Kate. The realization struck Elena like a bolt of lightning. She had seen the missing woman from the news, the same face that had graced countless news articles about the couple's mysterious disappearance on the cruise. The woman standing before her was undeniably Kate. Elena didn't think twice. She turned and walked away, her heart racing, fear rising in her chest. It wasn't until days later that Elena finally gathered the courage to speak up. She couldn't keep the secret anymore, but she also knew it wouldn't be easy to make anyone believe her. What would she say that she saw a woman who looked like Kate from the news, standing in front of a house in a neighborhood that seemed untouched by time, filled with houses that didn't seem to belong to anyone? But Elena had seen enough to know that there was something deeply wrong about the situation. There was a darkness that clung to that house, and to the woman standing on that porch. After days of doubt and fear, Elena made the call. She contacted the authorities, providing the tip about what she had seen, knowing that it might be dismissed as nothing more than an overactive imagination. The police were cautious but intrigued. After all, the tip came from someone who had no reason to make up such a story. They had to investigate. They had to at least try. They dug into the details of the house Elena had pointed out and found that it had been abandoned for years, with no apparent owner. Whoever had been living there had kept themselves out of sight, and nothing about the house's history raised any red flags at first. It was a dead end, or so they thought. However, Elena's tip would prove to be more than just a passing curiosity. In the weeks that followed, investigators focused on tracking down anyone who could have known about the house. They interviewed neighbors. Though no one seemed to know anything about the woman Elena had seen, no one had ever seen anyone enter or leave the house, and the street was quiet, untroubled by strangers. But the more they looked, the more they found strange connections. The house had once belonged to a man named Victor Ellis. a figure who had been involved in shady business dealings for years before mysteriously disappearing around the same time Kate and Jack had gone missing. No one had heard from Victor in over a decade, and his name had never come up in the case before. He was the kind of person who left no paper trail behind, who moved in and out of places without leaving a mark. In short, he was a ghost. But the authorities had finally found something that linked Victor Ellis to the world of organized crime. As they dug deeper into his connections, they uncovered a pattern. The house on the outskirts of Galveston had once been used as a safe house, a hideout for criminals involved in a number of illicit activities, including human trafficking. The pieces of the puzzle started to come together, and for the first time in 18 years, a chilling truth began to surface. What had happened to Kate and Jack was not a random accident. This was a planned, calculated operation, one that had been set in motion long before their cruise had even begun. The idea that someone had orchestrated their disappearance wasn't just a theory anymore. It was becoming an undeniable reality. Investigators began to dig into the trafficking network Victor Ellis had been a part of, and the evidence they found was disturbing. This was a vast and well-established ring, stretching across multiple states and involving high-ranking officials who had helped protect its operations. Kate had been caught in the crossfire of something much bigger than anyone had realized. As the investigation picked up steam, the search for Kate intensified. Elena's sighting had given them the lead they needed, but they still had no idea where she was or what had happened to her in the years since her disappearance. But the truth was now undeniable: Kate had been taken, and the world would soon learn just how deep the darkness surrounding her disappearance truly went. So, you're still following this story, right? If you're still listening, drop a comment and let me know what you think. Share your thoughts. I'm really curious to hear what you think about what's happened and what's unfolding. The investigation into Kate's disappearance had gained new momentum, but with it came a terrifying realization: the web of lies and secrecy surrounding her case was deeper and more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. As authorities began piecing together the mysterious circumstances of the vanishing couple, an unexpected breakthrough came from a source that had been buried in the past, a cryptic journal that had long remained untouched. It was found in an unlikely place tucked away in the attic of an old, abandoned house in a remote area of Texas, not far from Galveston. The house had once belonged to a woman named Sarah Turner, an eccentric figure who had lived alone for decades. She had been known for her strange behavior, often seen talking to herself or muttering about the darkness she had seen in the world. When Sarah passed away years ago, her estate was quickly liquidated, and the house was left to deteriorate, forgotten by time. But as investigators sifted through the remnants of Sarah's home, they came across something chilling. A small leather-bound journal, hidden beneath a pile of old, yellowed newspapers, lay untouched for years. Its pages were filled with handwriting, disjointed at times, but every now and then, the words seemed to fall into a haunting, coherent narrative. The journal's entries began innocuously enough. Sarah wrote about her mundane life, her walks through the neighborhood, the strange sounds she heard at night, and the unease she felt at the edges of her reality. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. There were mentions of figures she had seen around town, people who never seemed to belong. She described secretive meetings held at night in abandoned buildings and strange whispers in the dark. As the entries became more frequent, the language grew darker. Sarah began writing about the ship and its mysterious passengers. One entry stood out. I saw them again. The couple, the woman, her face. I remember it from the news. She's been taken. I saw her last night in the old house on the edge of town. She was so thin, and there was fear in her eyes. It was the same fear I saw in those other women. They are all prisoners. They are not just lost. They are being kept. The chilling reference to Kate was enough to send shivers down the spines of the investigators. It was clear that Sarah had seen Kate, or someone who looked like her, in the same area where Elena Hall had reported the sighting. The implication was that Kate hadn't just vanished, she had been taken and forced into a life of captivity. As the investigators read on, they uncovered more disturbing entries, describing a network of people who were being trafficked, all held by powerful individuals who moved in the shadows. Sarah had been tracking these people, writing down the details of what she saw, but she had never been able to expose them. She had even mentioned the name of the person she believed to be behind it all, Victor Ellis. This was the same Victor Ellis whose name had surfaced during the investigation into Kate's disappearance. Sarah's journal, though unsettling, provided critical clues. It wasn't just the eerie mention of a couple, or the detailed accounts of people in distress, but the fact that Sarah had managed to track down Victor Ellis's connection to this dark world. She spoke of a man who operated out of the shadows, pulling strings behind the scenes, orchestrating these disappearances and selling people into a life of captivity. The entries painted a picture of a group far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated, one that reached into every facet of society, from organized crime to high-ranking officials. The more the authorities read, the clearer it became that Kate and Jack had fallen victim to something far larger than a mere cruise ship mystery. Sarah's journal also included strange drawings, sketches of the layout of various ships, abandoned buildings, and dark alleyways. One drawing seemed to depict a cargo hold on a ship, something that matched the interior of the cruise ship Kate and Jack had been on. The drawings were rough, but detailed enough to indicate that Sarah had been trying to map out the paths these individuals took, to chart the hidden corners of the world where no one ever looked. It was then that the investigators realized the true horror Kate and Jack's disappearance had been carefully planned. They had been chosen. This wasn't a random act. They had been targeted, possibly because they were seen as easy targets on a cruise ship full of strangers. And once they were taken, the couple had been cast into a network of human trafficking, where they were forced to live out their worst nightmare. But the question remained, what had happened to Jack? The investigators had no answers to that yet, and the deeper they dug, the more elusive the truth became. One entry in Sarah's journal suggested that Jack might have been killed. It was cryptic, but the line was chilling. He was too much of a risk. They could not let him go. The assumption was that Jack had been murdered, perhaps because he had discovered something or was seen as a threat to the organization. If he had resisted or tried to escape, the network would have done whatever it took to silence him. Kate's fate, however, was another matter. Sarah's journal hinted at a darker truth that Kate had survived, but in a way that was almost worse than death. She had been forced into a life of slavery, held captive by the very people who had orchestrated her disappearance. And there, in the darkness of the hidden world Sarah had documented, Kate had been trapped. As investigators pored over Sarah's journal, they began to piece together the grim picture of Kate's years of captivity. They were no longer looking for a missing couple, they were hunting for a woman who had been lost in the deepest part of a sinister underworld for 18 years. And the truth was more horrifying than anyone had ever imagined. The journal's final entry was its most unsettling. They are all gone now, But she remains. She is still there. I have seen her again, locked away in a place that no one can find. It is too late for them, but perhaps not for her. Maybe there is still time. Maybe the truth will come out. The investigators knew one thing for sure: the search for Kate was far from over. The journal had provided them with the missing pieces. And now they had a new goal: to uncover the network that had enslaved her and bring the perpetrators to justice. The search was about to get darker. The chilling discovery of Sarah's journal was a crucial turning point in the investigation. But it was only the beginning. With the unsettling details about the dark network behind Kate and Jack's disappearance now in hand, the investigators needed to piece together the final days before the couple boarded the cruise ship. They hoped that retracing Kate and Jack's last steps would lead them to the key that would unlock the mystery of how they had been taken and, just as importantly, how to find Kate, who had been lost for 18 years. The first step was to look into the couple's lives before they left Austin. Kate and Jack had seemed like a normal young couple, both in their late 20s, both with steady jobs and close families. They had no known enemies, no apparent reason to disappear. But the deeper they dug, the more the investigators began to uncover hidden aspects of their lives that didn't add up. Kate had been a successful graphic designer, working from home most days. Jack, on the other hand, was a well-respected financial advisor, known for his sharp mind and strategic investments. Their careers seemed solid, their personal lives full of promise. But there were subtle signs that all was not as it seemed. Months before the cruise, Kate had grown increasingly anxious. She had mentioned to friends and family that she felt like someone was watching her. At first, they chalked it up to stress, maybe the pressure of her job, or simply the nerves of preparing for a big trip. But her unease seemed to intensify as the days passed, and her behavior began to change. She started canceling plans with friends, withdrawing from social activities, and becoming more isolated. Jack had noticed the change but hadn't thought much of it at first. He tried to comfort her, assuring her that everything was fine. But Kate couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. She would frequently check the locks on their doors and windows, and sometimes she'd disappear into the bathroom for long stretches of time, seemingly lost in thought. The investigators spoke to some of Kate's closest friends, hoping to get a better sense of what had been happening in the months leading up to the cruise. One friend, Rachel, recalled a conversation they'd had just weeks before Kate and Jack left for Galveston. Kate had confessed that she was worried, even scared, but wouldn't elaborate. "It's not just me," she had said cryptically, her voice trembling. "It's like they're all around me, and I don't know who to trust anymore." Rachel had brushed it off, assuming Kate was just experiencing a rough patch. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, it seemed clear that Kate had been trying to communicate something much more serious. She had been afraid of something, but she hadn't known who to turn to for help. The investigators also turned their attention to Jack. In the months leading up to the cruise, his behavior had been more normal, but they learned that Jack had become involved in some risky financial dealings that he had kept secret from his family. The nature of these dealings was unclear at first, but as they delved into Jack's records, it became apparent that he had been working with people who weren't entirely above board. Jack had made several large, off-the-books investments with an unnamed individual, a shadowy figure who was later connected to Victor Ellis and the human trafficking network. The investigators believed that this mysterious investor had played a role in drawing Jack into a world far darker than he could have imagined. Jack had been unknowingly caught up in something dangerous, and once he realized the true nature of his dealings, he might have tried to extricate himself, but it was too late. His involvement in the underground world had already made him a target. As the investigators spoke with more people who had interacted with Kate and Jack, they learned that the couple had acted strangely in the days leading up to their departure. They had started to act as though they were in a rush, packing hastily, cutting short conversations, and seeming distracted. Kate, in particular, had seemed withdrawn, like she was hiding something, though she never mentioned her fears again. The final conversation Kate had with her parents was the most telling. Kate had called them the night before they left for the cruise, and her voice was trembling. "I just need to go," she had said. Her words rushed and uneven. "I need to get away from here, from everything. It's too much. I think they've found me." But then, as quickly as she had said it, she fell silent, the line cutting out. Kate's parents tried calling her back, but there was no answer. It was the last time they heard from her. The investigators now had a clearer picture of the events leading up to the cruise. Kate had been terrified, trying to escape something or someone, but she had never gotten the chance to explain what she meant. Jack, it seemed, had been dragged into a much larger conspiracy, one that involved people he had trusted, but who had ultimately betrayed him. Together, they had unknowingly boarded a ship that would become their prison. But what was most chilling was the realization that they hadn't just been victims of random chance. Kate and Jack had been carefully selected. They had been chosen because of their proximity to a larger operation, an operation that was willing to do whatever it took to keep its secrets hidden. The investigators began to connect more dots between the couple's interactions, their secretive behavior, and the criminal activities they had unwittingly become entangled in. It was becoming clear that the cruise wasn't just a vacation. It had been a trap, a carefully orchestrated event designed to lure Kate and Jack into a situation where they could be controlled. As the investigators dug deeper, they realized that the network behind the couple's disappearance was vast and far-reaching. And they also realized something even more terrifying: whoever had orchestrated this plot was still out there, still pulling the strings, and still watching. The search for Kate and Jack had just begun, and the truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. As the investigation into Kate and Jack's disappearance unfolded, the authorities unearthed more clues, leading them deeper into a world of lies, manipulation, and danger. The most significant breakthrough came when they learned about a secret meeting that Kate and Jack had attended just days before boarding the cruise. This meeting, which they had kept hidden from everyone, was the key to understanding how they had been drawn into the criminal underworld. The meeting took place at an upscale, yet inconspicuous, conference room in a nondescript hotel in downtown Austin. The details of the event remained a mystery for years, but a series of anonymous tips eventually led investigators to interview one of the hotel's staff, who remembered the couple's visit. According to the hotel employee, Kate and Jack arrived separately, a few hours apart, neither showing any signs of familiarity with the others in the room. The gathering appeared to be a business affair, but the details were so vague that the staff member couldn't recall any specifics about the attendees. It wasn't until investigators cross-referenced the event with records of people who had attended that they uncovered something chilling. The couple had unknowingly been in the same room with some of the most powerful and dangerous figures in the criminal underworld. One of the attendees, a well-known businessman from Houston, had ties to human trafficking and organized crime. Another attendee, a retired military officer, had once been implicated in shady dealings involving offshore accounts and arms trading. But the most disturbing connection was with Victor Ellis, the elusive figure whose name had surfaced repeatedly in their investigation. It was clear now that this meeting had been a part of a much larger network, and Kate and Jack had been dragged into it without realizing the risks. The couple had attended this meeting with no idea of what they were walking into. Jack, in particular, had been unaware of the dangerous individuals he had been mingling with. He had thought the meeting was about a potential investment opportunity, one that would have allowed him to expand his financial portfolio. Kate, on the other hand, had seemed nervous from the moment she walked into the room. She had whispered to Jack, expressing doubts about being there, about the people they were meeting, and about the situation. She had tried to get Jack to leave, but he insisted they stay, promising her it was just a business affair. Little did they know, this meeting would be the turning point in their lives, one that would set off a chain of events that would result in their tragic and terrifying fate. During the meeting, Kate and Jack were introduced to a man named Alan Daniels, who appeared charming and friendly at first. Alan was a well-dressed man in his early 40s, with a polished demeanor and an air of authority that seemed to command respect. He spoke about opportunities in offshore investments, and his pitch was convincing. For Jack, it was a perfect business deal, low risk, high reward. But as the conversation unfolded, Jack began to notice the strange undertones in Alan's speech. There were references to connections and under-the-table deals, and something about Alan's demeanor made Jack uneasy. Kate, already on edge, grew more uncomfortable with every passing minute. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere in the room grew darker. Whispers spread about other opportunities that were available through these connections, though no one dared to go into detail. Kate's instincts were screaming at her to leave, but Jack was drawn in by the potential financial gain. He didn't understand that this was no ordinary investment opportunity. It was a trap, carefully set for him. At one point during the meeting, Kate excused herself to go to the restroom. It was there that she overheard a conversation between two men in the hallway, voices she didn't recognize, but whose tone immediately alarmed her. They were talking about taking care of the couple and discussing the best way to get them out of the picture without drawing attention. Kate, terrified, returned to the conference room, her heart pounding. She tried to get Jack to leave immediately, but by then, it was too late. Jack had already signed documents agreeing to a large investment, one that would put them deep into debt and tie them to the men they had just met. The details of the documents were vague, full of legal jargon and clauses that would have raised alarms if Jack had been able to fully understand them. But the couple had been entranced by the prospect of wealth and stability, never suspecting that the deal was a setup. Alan Daniels and the others in the room had all been part of the same network, an operation that used unsuspecting victims like Kate and Jack as pawns in a far more dangerous game. The following morning, Kate and Jack boarded the cruise ship, still unaware of the extent of the danger they were in. As the ship set sail from Galveston, they believed they were finally leaving behind the worries and stress of their everyday lives. Little did they know that their lives were about to be shattered. The investigators now had a much clearer picture of the events leading up to the disappearance. Kate and Jack had been targeted long before they set foot on the ship. They had been drawn into a network of criminals, manipulated into making a deal that would lead them directly into the hands of those who would exploit them. The cruise was not just a vacation, it was a carefully orchestrated trap. Kate and Jack's disappearance was not a random act. It was part of a larger plan, one that involved not just the couple, but many other unsuspecting victims. As the investigators pieced together the pieces of the puzzle, they began to realize just how far this operation reached. Victor Ellis, Alan Daniels, and others in the network were part of a global trafficking syndicate that spanned continents, operating in the shadows of the world. And Kate and Jack had been unfortunate enough to cross paths with them, but there was still one question that remained unanswered. Where was Kate? What had happened to her after Jack had been murdered? And how had she survived for so many years? Trapped in a nightmare far worse than anyone could have imagined, the investigation had taken a dark turn, and the truth was now more elusive than ever. The investigation had entered its most crucial phase, and with each passing day, the detectives grew more obsessed with uncovering the truth. They were closing in on a network so vast and deeply entrenched that every step they took seemed to raise more questions. But amid the growing chaos of leads and dead ends, a discovery was made that would bring them one step closer to uncovering the dark reality of Kate and Jack's fate. It was a small, seemingly insignificant find at first, but it would ultimately prove to be the key. While the cruise ship had long since been docked and the investigation had turned elsewhere, the ship itself was still under the jurisdiction of the authorities, now part of the ongoing inquiry. The owners of the cruise line, wary of the growing media attention, had reluctantly agreed to cooperate with the investigation and allowed police to conduct a thorough sweep of the ship. The search had yielded nothing in the months following the disappearance. But investigators, now more experienced and attuned to the hidden truths, decided to return to Deck 7 where Kate and Jack's cabin had been. During an inspection of the ship's lower levels, which had been neglected in previous searches, a maintenance crew working on repairs stumbled upon something unusual in the crew quarters. A sealed envelope had been wedged between the floorboards beneath a rusted metal panel in the cabin. It wasn't part of the regular search protocols. It was just a small piece of debris that had been overlooked. But the envelope, stained with dirt and slightly damaged from years of neglect, held something far more important than anyone had expected. Inside the envelope was a photograph. The image, though faded and worn, was unmistakable. It showed Kate and Jack, but they were not posing happily on vacation like in the photos taken earlier on the trip. Instead, the picture was taken in a secluded part of the ship, and both appeared to be visibly distressed. Their eyes, wide with fear, stared directly at the camera, as if they knew something terrible was about to unfold. The unsettling part was the background. There was a door partially open, leading into what appeared to be a dark, hidden space that wasn't on any of the ship's blueprints. The investigators studied the photograph in silence. It was clear from their expressions that something had gone terribly wrong, something they had only just realized. Kate and Jack were not captured in a moment of carefree enjoyment. They were scared, trapped in a place they weren't supposed to be. The photograph was proof that they had uncovered a secret part of the ship, one that wasn't listed on any of the official documents or plans. The most chilling part of the photograph was the subtle detail that had been missed earlier in the far corner of the image, almost obscured by shadows. There was a man standing, his face barely visible, but his dark silhouette unmistakable. The man's presence was jarring. It was a figure none of the investigators recognized. A stranger with an air of authority. It was as though he were watching them, monitoring their every move. The investigators couldn't be sure who he was, but the implications were clear. The ship was hiding something far worse than anyone had imagined. The photograph had clearly been taken in a part of the ship where no passengers were supposed to go. The discovery led to another disturbing thought. Had Kate and Jack been lured there? Had they been taken to this hidden section of the ship by someone they trusted, or someone who had been waiting for them? As the investigators combed through the photograph, one detective noticed something else, a symbol. Faint but visible, etched into the wall behind them. It was a symbol that didn't belong to the cruise line. The symbol, simple yet strange, appeared to be a logo, something that resembled a triangle, interlocked with several other shapes. It was a motif that repeated in several places across the ship, but nowhere else had it been so prominently displayed. It wasn't just a decoration or part of the ship's design. It was part of something else, something hidden in plain sight. The investigation shifted gears. What was this symbol, and what did it mean? The detective tasked with researching it soon found that it was tied to a group known for operating in the shadows, a network that had been involved in international human trafficking, illegal trading, and dark business dealings. The symbol wasn't random. It was a marker, a sign of ownership, and it indicated that the area where Kate and Jack had been photographed was connected to this clandestine group. The more the investigators dug into the connections, the more they realized that this hidden part of the ship wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a network that spanned the globe, stretching into high-level organizations and corrupt officials. The ship had unknowingly been a front for this operation, a safe space for criminals to conduct their business without being detected. The investigators now had undeniable evidence that Kate and Jack had stumbled upon something they were never meant to find. They hadn't just been victims of a random disappearance. They had been caught in the web of a criminal syndicate, one that operated across borders and continents, manipulating and controlling unsuspecting individuals. But while this discovery was groundbreaking, it raised even more questions. How had Kate and Jack ended up in this part of the ship had they been given a choice? Or had they been forced into the network's grasp the moment they boarded the ship? And where had they gone after the photograph was taken? The authorities now understood the magnitude of what had happened. Kate and Jack had been targeted long before they boarded the cruise ship. The network had known who they were, what they were capable of, and how to lure them into the trap. But the worst part was that the investigation was just beginning. The truth, though finally within their reach, it was still far from clear. And Kate's survival remained a mystery. With every new piece of evidence, the sense of urgency grew. The investigators knew that time was running out. Kate had been lost for nearly 2 decades, and every moment they spent in search of the truth brought them closer to uncovering something much darker than they had ever imagined. The search for Kate had taken the investigation down a path that no one had expected. They had discovered hidden spaces within the cruise ship, cryptic symbols marking the site of the couple's last moments, and dark connections to an international trafficking network. But as they pieced together the shocking revelations, they needed someone who had seen the events unfold from within the shadows, someone who had been there, someone who could help them uncover the final pieces of the puzzle. Enter Derek Woods. Derek had once been a crew member on the cruise ship, a low-level employee in the maintenance department, who had quietly worked his way through the ranks. But by the time Kate and Jack had boarded the ship, Derek had already left the company, distancing himself from the life he had once led. It wasn't until he saw the news about the missing couple years later that he realized how much he had witnessed and how dangerous the situation truly was. At first, Derek had wanted nothing to do with the investigation. He had left his past behind him, and the memories of his time on the ship were ones he didn't care to revisit. The cruise line, after all, had been more than just a job. It had been a way out of a life he wasn't proud of. But as the years went by, Derek had learned more about the dark underworld that ran beneath the surface of the luxurious cruise industry. His time spent working on the ship had exposed him to things he wasn't prepared for, and he knew that if he didn't come forward now, the truth would remain buried forever. One evening, after hours of searching for the right words, Derek reached out to the authorities. His voice was shaky on the phone, his guilt clear in every word. But the investigators listened intently as he described what he had seen during his time on the ship. His testimony wasn't easy to hear. The things he had witnessed were disturbing, and the implications were far worse than anyone could have guessed. Derek told the investigators that, as a crew member, he had access to nearly every part of the ship, places that the passengers never saw, and spaces that were purposefully kept hidden. He spoke about the restricted areas, where crew members were sometimes instructed to keep quiet about what they saw, and where strange deliveries were made under the cover of darkness. He described strange individuals who came and went without explanation, always in the company of people who appeared to be tourists, but whose faces Derek had never seen before. It was one such encounter that Derek recalled vividly, just days before Kate and Jack's disappearance. He had seen them in one of these hidden areas. They had entered a part of the ship that was usually off-limits to both passengers and crew, a section behind the main passenger decks, where the engines and machinery were housed. Derek had been performing a routine check when he saw Kate and Jack walking along a narrow hallway. They had been speaking softly to each other, their expressions tense. As they passed Derek, he had heard Jack mention something about an urgent matter and needing to speak to someone. It wasn't until later that Derek realized they had been speaking about someone in particular. He didn't know who they were looking for at the time, but now, after everything he had learned about Victor Ellis and the network that had been operating under the radar, Derek had his suspicions. It was clear to him now that Jack and Kate had stumbled onto something dangerous, something bigger than they could have ever imagined. Derek's revelation about that night in the hallway only deepened the mystery. It was no longer just about the missing couple. It was about what they had discovered. They had uncovered a part of the ship that was hidden from the public, a place where deals were made in the shadows, and where victims were brought and held before being moved out of sight. The pieces were finally starting to fit together, but the truth was even darker than anyone had thought. Derek also recalled a specific incident a few days after Kate and Jack's disappearance. He had witnessed a group of men unloading large crates from a cargo area, crates that appeared to be filled with nothing but empty space. They had been moved quickly and quietly, as though no one was supposed to know about them. At the time, Derek hadn't thought much of it, but now, he knew that those crates had been used to smuggle people like Kate and Jack into a different world. For years, the ship had acted as a perfect cover for the network's operations. With its ever-changing passengers, constant movement, and thousands of people coming and going without raising any suspicion, the cruise ships were the ideal transportation for those who needed to remain hidden. What struck Derek the most was his own guilt. He had known something wasn't right. He had seen the signs and ignored them. He had heard whispers among the crew about strange operations taking place on the ship, about people being brought on board, about cargo being unloaded in the dead of night. But he had kept his head down, fearful of what might happen to him if he spoke out. He had chosen to walk away rather than confront the darkness that had permeated the ship. But now, years later, he knew that the only way to atone for his inaction was to come forward with everything he knew. And what he knew was more than enough to bring the investigation to a head. Kate and Jack hadn't just disappeared. They had been caught in a world far more dangerous than anyone had realized. And Derek had been an unwilling witness to it all. As the investigators listened to Derek's testimony, they knew they had finally found the missing piece. Derek's information led them to a hidden compartment on the ship, a place where illegal transactions were carried out, where people were held captive before being moved to their next destination. It was clear that Kate had been brought here, and that her journey had only just begun. The investigators now had enough evidence to begin tracking down the individuals responsible for the trafficking operation. But even with Derek's testimony, the biggest question remained unanswered. Where was Kate, and how had she survived the years of captivity, hidden away from the world? The investigation was closer than ever to uncovering the truth, but the most important part of the puzzle was still missing. With Derek's information, the authorities now knew where to focus their efforts. They had a new target, one that would finally bring them closer to Kate. But as they prepared to launch a rescue operation, they also understood the stakes. The criminals who had been operating in the shadows were desperate, and they would stop at nothing to protect their empire. The truth was finally within reach. But the most terrifying realization had yet to come. The investigation was only just beginning, and Kate's ordeal was far from over. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but with every revelation, the danger grew. The investigation into the criminal network behind Kate and Jack's disappearance had uncovered a staggering truth. This was not just an isolated incident, but a vast operation that spanned continents, exploiting and trafficking victims for profit. The authorities now understood that the couple's disappearance was only a small part of a much darker, far-reaching conspiracy. The more they dug, the more chilling the connections became. Kate and Jack hadn't just been targeted by random criminals, they had become part of a system, a well-oiled machine that profited from the suffering of others. The ship, the cruise line, and the entire operation were just the tip of the iceberg. Behind the scenes, a powerful network had been working for years, with its tendrils stretching into the highest echelons of business, law enforcement, and government. The investigators knew they had to act quickly. Every day that passed was another day Kate remained in the grip of her captors. With Derek's testimony, they had been able to locate a hidden compartment on the ship, a secret cargo hold that had been used to smuggle victims like Kate and Jack into the hands of the network. But they also learned that the trafficking operation didn't stop at the cruise lines. It was a global enterprise that moved its victims from one country to another, from one hidden location to the next, with no regard for the lives they destroyed in the process. The network's reach was extensive, and its operations were sophisticated. They used a series of safe houses, abandoned buildings, and hidden locations to store and transport their victims. The hidden compartment on the ship was just one of many places where people were held before being moved to other parts of the world, sometimes never to be seen again. As the authorities connected the dots, They realized that Kate's captivity had been part of a much larger scheme, one that involved countless victims, many of whom had been lost to the shadows, their identities erased, their lives discarded. In their search for answers, the investigators uncovered several other cases of missing individuals, many of whom had been taken under similar circumstances to Kate and Jack. The pattern was clear. The network targeted vulnerable people, lured them in with false promises, and then erased their existence from the world. Those who were lucky enough to survive, like Kate, were kept under strict control, their freedom stolen, their voices silenced. But the most disturbing discovery came when the investigators learned that some of the individuals involved in the trafficking network were people they had once trusted. They uncovered a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government, law enforcement, and even the cruise industry itself. There were people who had turned a blind eye, or worse, who had been complicit in the operation, helping to cover up the disappearances and silence those who tried to speak out. As the investigation progressed, the authorities began to see the full extent of the conspiracy. The network had been operating in plain sight, hidden in the shadows of the everyday world. They had used legitimate businesses as fronts for their operations, employing corrupt officials to protect their interests. The cruise lines, once seen as safe and luxurious, had become unwitting accomplices in a larger scheme, with employees like Derek witnessing the horrors but being too afraid to speak out. The deeper the investigators delved, the more they uncovered a network that was impossible to fully dismantle. It wasn't just about rescuing Kate, it was about exposing the entire operation, one that had been thriving for years, unchecked. As they began to unravel the threads, they realized just how many lives had been affected by the network's reach. Kate had been one of many victims, but her story was now the key to bringing down the empire built on human misery. The authorities knew that they had to move quickly. They were on the verge of a breakthrough, and Kate's survival depended on their ability to act fast. They needed to locate her before the criminals behind the operation had a chance to move her again. Every moment was crucial, and they could not afford to waste any more time. A large-scale rescue operation was set into motion. The investigators, now working in tandem with international law enforcement agencies, began to track down the safe houses and hidden locations used by the network. They followed the trail left by the traffickers, piecing together the routes used to transport victims. They knew that Kate was somewhere within this labyrinth, waiting to be found. The operation was intense and highly coordinated. Law enforcement agencies from several countries came together, pooling their resources and knowledge to track down the criminals. The rescue mission was planned with precision, every detail accounted for. It was a race against time. Kate, along with many others, was still trapped in a nightmare, and they needed to be freed before the criminals could erase all evidence of their crimes. As the operation unfolded, the investigators discovered something even more shocking. The criminals had been anticipating the raid. They had learned about the investigation, and they were prepared to fight back. A final confrontation was inevitable. The authorities, now armed with the full scope of the network's operations, prepared for a showdown that would determine the fate of Kate and many others. The rescue operation would not be easy. The criminals were ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to protect their empire. But the authorities were determined to end the nightmare. They had spent years chasing down leads, gathering evidence, and fighting through layers of deception. Now, they were finally in a position to strike back. The truth about the trafficking network was out. The authorities knew what they were up against, and they were ready to face it head-on. The question remained, would they be able to rescue Kate in time? Or would the criminals manage to cover their tracks one final time as the global rescue operation began to take shape, and law enforcement tightened its grip on the criminal network? A new piece of evidence surfaced, one that would both horrify and galvanize the investigation into overdrive. It wasn't a traditional lead or tip from an informant. This was something far more unsettling: video footage that had been anonymously uploaded to the internet. The video was brief, but the impact it had was immediate. It showed a dark, poorly lit hallway somewhere deep within the bowels of a building that appeared to be in a remote location. At first glance, it seemed like just another grainy, low-quality clip, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the footage continued, something chilling emerged. In the flickering light of the video, Kate and Jack appeared, though not as they had once been. Their faces were gaunt, their clothes ragged. Both looked terrified, their eyes wide with fear, desperately scanning their surroundings. They walked slowly down the hall, with the sounds of footsteps echoing off the walls. They were clearly trying to escape, but they were also aware of something or someone closely following them. Jack's face, though strained, was set with a determination. He seemed to be trying to guide Kate, urging her to keep moving forward, though there was little hope in his eyes. Kate's expression was one of sheer panic, her body tense, as if she knew their escape would be short-lived. The most disturbing part of the video, however, was the silence except for the occasional distant voices and muffled footsteps. There was nothing, no dialogue, no one speaking directly to the couple. It was as though they were trying to avoid detection, trying to flee from something much more sinister than just their captors. Then, at the far end of the hall, something appeared, a figure emerging from the darkness, slowly approaching them. It was a man, tall and imposing, his silhouette barely discernible in the low light. His presence was menacing, and as he stepped forward into the frame, the couple froze, their bodies rigid with terror. Kate reached for Jack's arm, her grip tight, as if trying to shield herself from the man. Jack, however, seemed to make a final decision. He stepped forward, as if to confront their captor, though the video cut out abruptly just as the man advanced toward them. The video ended there, leaving the authorities with more questions than answers. It was clear that Kate and Jack had been in the midst of an escape attempt, and from the looks of it, they had been caught just moments before. The authorities immediately started working to trace the video's origins, hoping it could lead them to Kate's current location. But what they saw in the footage was haunting, and the implications were even more terrifying. Jack was no longer alive. The fact that the video had surfaced now, after all these years, meant one thing: the criminals behind the trafficking network were aware that the investigation was closing in on them. They had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks, but now, the video served as both a warning and a clue. Kate had survived, but Jack had not. He had been murdered during this escape attempt, possibly moments after the video cut off. In the midst of all this, the authorities had no time to grieve for Jack. Their focus was on Kate, whose life still hung in the balance. The video revealed not just her terror, but her tenacity. She had been trying to escape, trying to free herself from the nightmare she had been trapped in for almost 2 decades. It was clear that she'd been fighting for survival the entire time. As the investigators analyzed the video further, they identified the man in the footage. He was a known figure, one of the key players in the trafficking network, a man named Grigor Vasilyev, a notorious enforcer with connections to Victor Ellis. Vasilyev had been involved in the operation from the very beginning, and his face was now recognized as a major piece of the puzzle. Vasilyev's role was chilling. He wasn't just a part of the network, he was its enforcer, someone who ensured that victims stayed silent, obeyed orders, and never escaped. He was cold, calculated, and ruthless. In the video, his calm demeanor as he approached the couple made it clear that he had been in control of the situation. The authorities knew that if they didn't act quickly, Vasilyev would make sure that Kate would never be seen again. The footage raised the stakes of the operation. Now, with a concrete lead on Vasilyev's involvement and a clear indication that Kate was still alive, the investigators had to move swiftly. The window of opportunity was shrinking. The network's enforcers would not allow Kate to be rescued without a fight. The authorities worked with an urgency they had never felt before. Every available resource was mobilized. Interpol, local law enforcement, and even private security forces began to coordinate efforts to locate the building shown in the video. They knew that Kate had been somewhere in that compound when the video was taken, but they had no idea where it was. Every hour that passed made it more likely that the criminals would move her again, hiding her away in a place that would be impossible to track. What they didn't know was that the video, though crucial, was only the tip of the iceberg. As the authorities closed in on Vasilyev and his location, they discovered a network of secret hideouts that extended across multiple countries. Vasilyev wasn't alone in his operations. He was part of a much larger operation, one that had spread its roots into every corner of the world. The task force realized just how deep the conspiracy went and how high it reached. The investigation had become a race against time. The rescue mission was no longer just about saving one woman. It was about dismantling an empire built on human suffering, and about bringing down the people who thought they could operate with impunity. But despite the overwhelming odds, the authorities remained determined. They were closer than ever to finding Kate, and with the evidence from the video, they knew they had a chance to rescue her. But there was no denying the fact that the criminals were desperate, and desperate men would stop at nothing to protect their empire. The final confrontation was coming, and only one question remained: would Kate be freed in time, or would she vanish once again? This time forever, the investigation had reached a critical juncture. The video footage, Derek's testimony, and the connections to the larger trafficking network had all brought the authorities closer to the truth. They now had a clear target: Vasilyev, the ruthless enforcer of the operation, and his hideout where Kate had been seen. The rescue operation was imminent, and every agency involved knew that they had only one shot to save her. The clock was ticking. The final stages of the operation were a blur of activity. Coordinated efforts across countries were underway, and the task force had pinpointed the location from the video footage, a remote compound in Eastern Europe, far from where the investigation had started. Intelligence gathered over the past few days indicated that Kate was being held there, though her exact condition was still unknown. What they did know was that the criminals running the operation would do anything to keep her from escaping again. But it wasn't just Kate who was in danger now. The investigation had uncovered the full extent of the trafficking network. and the criminals knew their empire was at risk of being exposed. They had tried to cover their tracks for years, hiding behind corrupt officials and powerful figures. But now, with the task force closing in, they had one final card to play: destroy the evidence and erase anyone who could bring them down. Yeah. The plan for Kate's rescue was carefully devised. Special Forces teams were in place. Intelligence operatives had infiltrated the network, and the best minds in law enforcement had been brought together to ensure success. Every possible contingency had been planned for. The mission was clear: rescue Kate, apprehend Vasilyev, and dismantle the operation before it could do any more harm. The final confrontation unfolded in the dead of night, the air thick with tension. A helicopter carrying the rescue team hovered above the compound, its searchlights cutting through the darkness. Ground teams moved swiftly, breaching the compound's perimeter with precision, and securing the building where Kate was believed to be held. Inside the compound, Kate's heart raced as she heard the sounds of chaos erupting outside. She had been locked in a small, dimly lit room for what felt like an eternity. But she knew the moment had come. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment when someone, anyone, would finally come for her. The sound of distant gunfire echoed in the hallways as the authorities closed in. Then, the door to her room swung open. For a moment, Kate thought it was another one of her captors, coming to silence her once and for all. But as the light from the hallway flooded the room, she saw the figure standing in the doorway, a law enforcement officer, wearing a tactical helmet and gear. The officer's voice was muffled, but Kate recognized the urgency in it. "We're here to rescue you," he said, pulling her into his arms. She didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or collapse from exhaustion, but all she could do was nod. She was finally free. The rescue team moved quickly, ushering Kate to safety as the operation continued to unfold. Vasilyev and his men had tried to flee, but they were too late. The authorities had anticipated their every move. And one by one, they were apprehended. Vasilyev, the man who had hunted Kate for years, was cornered in a remote part of the compound. A final confrontation ensued, and within moments, he was taken into custody. As the compound was cleared and the criminals were rounded up, the full scope of their operation came to light. The authorities discovered evidence of hundreds of victims, people like Kate, who had been trafficked and sold across borders, their lives torn apart. The compound had been a hub for smuggling, housing victims before they were moved to other locations. For Kate, the knowledge that she was one of many victims gave her both a sense of relief and a deep sense of sorrow for the others who had suffered in silence. In the aftermath of the raid, Kate was taken to a medical facility, where she was given the care and support she needed. She was weak, exhausted, and traumatized. But she was alive. She had survived 18 years of unimaginable hardship, and though the road to recovery would be long, she was no longer a prisoner, but there was no escaping the emotional toll. As she began to process what had happened, Kate found herself haunted by the memories of Jack, memories of their last moments together, of their desperate escape attempt. She never saw him again after that video, but in her heart, she knew what had happened. He had been killed, and she had been left behind to survive alone. Though she had been freed from captivity, Kate's journey was far from over. The psychological scars she carried would take time to heal. But with the support of law enforcement and the people who cared about her, she slowly began to rebuild her life. Her story was one of survival, but it was also a reminder of the horrors that still existed in the world, horrors that could be hidden behind the veneer of normalcy. As the investigation continued, the authorities brought the criminals to justice. The trafficking ring, once thought to be untouchable, was brought down in one fell swoop. Victor Ellis, the mastermind behind the entire operation, was arrested along with his key associates. The trial that followed was intense, with shocking testimonies from victims and law enforcement alike. But despite the conviction of those responsible, the story didn't end there. The case sparked widespread awareness about human trafficking, leading to reforms in law enforcement and greater efforts to combat such crimes. Kate's bravery in coming forward, sharing her story, and helping to expose the network was instrumental in dismantling the operation and bringing justice to others. In the final moments of the trial, as Kate sat in the courtroom and watched the criminals who had tormented her for so many years being led away in handcuffs, she found a sense of peace. She would never forget what happened to her. But she knew that she had survived not just for herself, but for the others who had never been rescued. The haunting memories would always be with her. But Kate had taken the first step toward healing. She had faced the darkest part of her life and emerged stronger, a survivor. And as she walked out of the courtroom, her steps no longer hesitant, she knew that she was no longer defined by her past. She was free. And that was the only thing that mattered.